So we now focus on another area of resistance to this vast expansion. Resistance that comes from the indigenous populations of North America, which, as we know, were estimated at about 5 to 10 million before Columbus' accident, so to speak. So how does the U.S. government, developing power of the United States, deal with this resistance? First by displacement, and then really by extermination. Displacement to the lands west of Mississippi. We remember that west of Mississippi, especially in the middle of the century, early century, were considered an area where the investors didn't have much interest. So displacement is the first strategy that is adopted. And to the indigenous people of the Americas, who were gatherers and hunters and lived off what was naturally produced of a certain ecosystem, a certain territory. Displacement is very negative to their territorial awareness. In other words, by changing climate, by saying, from the Midwest to the plains of the Southwest, in a different ecosystem, in a different climate zone, their culture is lost. All their territorial awareness, all their knowledge in relation to the plant world and the animal world is inapplicable. And so they become much weaker in that new situation. And eventually we also have military attacks on the displaced Native Americans that eventually also defeat them militarily. So we have two symbolic battles where we see the significance of this resistance, and at the same time we see that the stronger weapons end up winning. One is the Battle of Little Big Horn in 1876 in Montana, and the other one is the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 in South Dakota. We have to remember that these Native American people were people who had lived in harmony with the earth on the North American continent for centuries. They had evolved sustainable lifestyles and cultures, and they had a whole wealth of knowledge that about how to steward this land in a sustainable way that was unfortunately lost with them. And we are in an era now where we can see the value of what was lost. A third area of resistance was obviously the resistance that came from the African population that had been imported as slaves to the United States. In this area, first we have to observe that probably, if you were a slave, you didn't have a whole lot of interest in seeing the United States expand, because that would only mean that there would be more slaves like you. But there's also a very important factor that basically within the northeast and the southeast region of the United States, there was a mounting tension. Okay, the northeast was an industrial economy based on paid labor that attracted a lot of immigrants who wanted to get paid. The southeast was a plantation economy based on unpaid labor and therefore needing more and more slaves, even either from the slave trade or via the reproduction of slavery. So during the 19th century, resentment and mistrust grew between these two cultures, these two regions. Then, of course, because nobody likes to be enslaved and there's always resistance whenever it's possible, the people activated a movement called, for example, one of the important movements, sort of people activated by fugitive slaves and by those people who understood their predicament, was known as the Underground Railroad. What was the Underground Railroad? It was a series of stations and shelters for runaway slaves that enabled these fugitives from the slavery states in the southeast of the United States to reach either a northern state where slavery was not practiced, and therefore the former slave would be respected as a free person, unless the owner would come and recapture this person. And then Canada, where slavery was illegal. So the more fugitive slaves via the Underground Railroad reached freedom, the more other slaves they could help in that same effort. And so communities of free African Americans formed in these northern states and then in Canada that were then very instrumental in what was to follow, which is the war known as the Civil War. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as president. He was a Republican. And it is at this time that this conflict between the two cultures exploded, between the industrial and the plantation societies. And one could say that the Civil War was also the second chapter of the American Revolution, because finally it was to establish freedom for all people. It was to establish the principle that came from the Enlightenment that people are not property. So on the 1st of January of 1863, Lincoln emanated the Proclamation of Emancipation. So this was the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery. Therefore, the Union, which was the League of the Northern States who didn't practice slavery and wanted it abolished, won the Civil War, and the states of the Confederate League, the Confederate states of the South, were now forced to abolish slavery and stop practicing this treatment of people as property. The period that immediately followed the Civil War is known as the period of Reconstruction, and it really is a period in which the civil society, the different parties in the civil society, start seeing each other in a new light and collaborate to create a new balance. However, it is quickly followed by a period when segregation becomes enforced. That period is known as the Jim Crow. Those are the Jim Crow laws of segregation, and therefore the African Americans who have acquired freedom really are still treated as unequal and often kept from practicing those freedoms, including the freedom to vote, for example, for another half century or more. So finally, we come to the third region we are going to look at in this understanding of how things evolve in the Americas in the 19th century, and that is Latin America. In this area, we've noticed fragmentation and also political experimentation. We are aware that in most Latin American countries, ex-colonies of Spain or of Portugal, in the case of Brazil, there was a Creole elite. Okay. However, we have to remember what kind of governance these Creole elites had been accustomed from Spanish rule. We remember that the governance from Spain was very autocratic. Everything was centered in the viceroy that then corresponded directly to the Crown of Spain. So people were not very accustomed to self-government. They were not accustomed to making small decisions independently of approval of the supervisors or not. Just that kind of mindset where if I know something is right, it's according to a rule, I'll just go ahead and do it instead of waiting for approval from my superior. So these Creole elites now, in the era of independence, were not very capable of self-government because they hadn't practiced it. An additional element for this region, since most of it is in the tropical climate zone, is that the natural ways of life of the indigenous populations of the Americas, it's like, say, the Amazon or other indigenous populations of the Andes or even of the Caribbean islands, it was a very natural lifestyle, right? because the tropical climate allows sort of living in communion with nature more than other climates, where there's always abundance. It's always a harvest or a growing season. There isn't that need for that preoccupation with scarcity, with cold periods where nothing grows, and if you have nothing stores, you're going to starve. So the presence of the indigenous populations in all of these regions is more significant. Regardless of the exterminations, it's still a more significant presence than in other climate zones. So eventually, the societies of these regions become organized around regional military leaders, often known as caudillos, who in some ways manage to keep the peace among all the different elements as regional military leaders. We focus on Mexico because it is exemplar of a country, an independent country that in a way stands to lose for what the United States gains in very significant ways. So Mexico becomes independent in 1810. And after the defeat of the Mexican-American War in 1848, the President Benito Juarez is elected. He is a person of indigenous ancestry, and he leads a movement for modernization of the country, including universal male suffrage, civil liberties, and freedom of speech. So in a way, he wants to move the country forward, especially since whatever is left of Mexico, he feels needs to really move forward, because Mexico has lost a lot of very significant territory to the Mexican-American War. In addition to that, at some point Juarez decides that he cannot make the payments, the war repair payments to the European powers. And Napoleon, Napoleon III, who at that point reigns in France, isn't happy with that. And so he sends troops led by the Archduke Maximilian, and then a Mexican fire squad kills the Duke. So in 1867, okay? So then Mexico comes into a period of instability that eventually leads to the Mexican Revolution. So to put it briefly, Juarez tries reforms, but then for a conjunction of factors, loss of territory, the hostility of France, these reforms are not capable of creating a new stability for the country. So in the early 20th century, we have an actual revolution. And we're talking about the years between 1911 and 1920. Okay. From this revolution emerges a much more radical leadership of people like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, who pressed for an actual land reform. They didn't press for civil liberties. They wanted the peasants, and especially many of the indigenous peasants who had no land, to get some land, right? They wanted a redistribution of the land wealth from the big haciendas, the big haciendados that owned a lot of land, to the small growers, the small peasants, many of whom were indigenous. It is estimated that about 2 million people, 2 million Mexicans, died in the era of revolution. And eventually in 1917, the Mexican Constitution was written, which incorporated some of these reforms, and that's how the country found a new stability. But we do see that in a way, not all countries stood a chance to really expand territorially, and that some lost territory in the Americas at the expense of other American countries. Okay, and now we also want to focus a little more closely on the lands that that concern us the most from our perspective here in Puerto Rico. So we remember that Puerto Rico and Cuba, the two islands, the two Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and Cuba, were the remaining Spanish colonies of, in the 19th century, the only colonies that Spain still had in the Americas. Spain also had, the Philippines were also a Spanish colony, but not in the Americas at that point. So at some point, Cuba wants independence from Spain. And the US says, okay, we'll help you. And that's how we got into the Spanish-American War. Okay, remember the Monroe effect, according to which the idea was that whenever a country wanted independence from a European power, then the US would help and then incorporate it. Okay, so Spain loses the Spanish-American War, and that's how the US gets Cuba and then gets Puerto Rico. Eventually, Cuba has its own revolution in the 20th century, and Puerto Rico still is a territory of the US, an island that is annexed to the US, but not as a state, but rather as an associated territory. Okay, so now we look at the economic aspect of all these transformations that happen in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century. From the economic viewpoint, clearly the hemisphere stands to gain all the labor, mainly the paid labor, because remember that slavery and slave trade were now were abolished, at least in the second half of the century. That comes from migration. Okay, this is a huge factor in the economic development because these people, they want to get paid for their labor, but they work very hard. Okay, and so we focus on industrial migrants and plantation migrants. All migrants come from the old world. They come from European countries and sometimes from Asian countries. They come mainly from countries that did not have colonies. So they were that kind of population that wanted to look for a better life, but their country didn't have a colony, and so going to a colony was not an option. Okay, industrial migrants typically go to countries like the United States and Canada. They come from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Scandinavia, and then eventually from Poland, Russia, Greece, and Italy. And many of them, of course, were Jews, regardless of what country they came from. Then we have plantation migrants. Often they go to Latin America. Some came from Europe, for example, the 4 million Italians who went to Argentina. And many came from Asia, including people from China, Japan, and the Philippines. And they go sometimes to the US to work in the agricultural fields, and some go to Cuba. Okay. From the point of view of the economy, what happens to the economy of these three regions that we are focusing on? In the US, we notice a blistering expansion. How is that possible? Partly because the British, as colonials, had made an investment in the infrastructure. They had invested capital in the infrastructure of their colonies, including building railroads. And partly, of course, because the more infrastructure, the more immigrants will be attracted to power that infrastructure and therefore build the nation's wealth. In Canada, we observe prosperity from the economic viewpoint, and the policy, the national policy was for an economy that was diversified. In other words, not building excessively any sector of the economy, but building a diversified economy. In Latin America, we observe more dependence. How does that happen? We know that that there was a custom of favoring the local oligarchies, the few families that benefited from the plantation economies, many of whom often had no vision for a way to evolve, and therefore it made no investments in the infrastructure, and therefore did not attract a lot of human capital, put it that way. So this was partly due, of course, to the style of coloniality practiced from Spain, as we have seen, that was rather autarchical and therefore didn't encourage people to have a lot of imagination. And we also see how a society evolves as a result of all these transformations. In the Western Hemisphere, in the 19th century, we have society is characterized by the multiple cultures of the people who now live on these lands, cultures that intersect, collide, amalgamate in different ways. So here too we observe what are the prominent practices in the US, in Canada, and then in Latin America. We've seen that for the US, resistance to the expansion came from native people, from freed slaves, and then there was the factor of the many immigrants that came, and the fact that women in that context wanted to also participate more prominently outside of the sphere of domesticity. Okay, so the policy with the native people was, with whatever was left of the native people after the displacement and after the military defeats, was to integrate and assimilate. This went to the extent that sometimes the children would be taken away from a family of Native Americans so that they could be educated to think like Westerners. It was a very violent assimilation practice. With the freed slaves, we see that in the brief Reconstruction period, the freedom that now had been obtained was actually practiced. But then, with the Jim Crow segregation, equality became impossible because the freedoms could not be practiced. They were more nominal than anything real. And then we note that in the period between 1840 and 1914, the United States absorbed 40 million immigrants from many different countries in the world, 40 million people who came to work and powered the economy. That is a lot of labor capital. Women in the United States formed movements to move toward alternatives to domesticity. One of them was the suffrage movement, which advocated votes for women, but not just votes, also education, also ability to access the professions, ability to manifest all the potential that women have for participation in society. In Canada, we also observed the displacement of indigenous people toward the western lands. We observed marginalization of immigrants who were Chinese or black, and that the country absorbed about 3 million immigrants from 1896 to 1914. Not as significant a contingent as in the United States, but still quite important. In Latin America, we are aware that more mestization had happened in the previous centuries. There were mestizos, mulattoes, zambus, castizos, so people had hybridated more from the genetic viewpoint, but there were hierarchies that were based on ethnicity and color. At this point, we have new groups of migrants that bring new diversity because they come from different countries. And the figure that starts to dominate the social scene is somebody often known as a gaucho. Gaucho is a name for a cowboy. So in the pampas of Argentina, for example, the gaucho is the one who can herd the cattle that are the main economic resource of the area, with his courage and his bravery. So between the gauchos and the caudillos, that is regional military leader, we see that the society that emerges is one that is dominated by males who exhibit typical courage and bravery. And so that's where we see the emergence of machismo, and the fact that in fact women, even though they don't exactly like being relegated into the area of domesticity, end up not having access to much else. We now come to the fourth chapter of part 6, the part of our course dedicated to the age of revolution, industry, and empire. Chapter 4 is also the last chapter of this part. and its title is The Building of Global Empires. So the focus of this chapter will be on the old world, namely the Eurasian empires that grew and acquired strength, that expanded in the period at the turn of the 19th century leading up to the period of World War I, and also on the empire that declined. We will look at what factors caused empires to expand or decline, and by and large at what a society organized around empire looks like, of how this practice of imperialism affects people. So we will focus in particular on 4 parts: the foundations of empire, the European imperialism, the new imperial powers that emerge in this era, and then the legacies of imperialism. By and large, we can say that the empires that acquire strength and expanded in this era are empires that are anchored to an industrial society, to an industrial economy in the mainland, and that have strong maritime connections with their overseas colonies. And these include Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then eventually Germany, Italy, and Japan. The empires that lost territory and declined during this period are the ones that are anchored to a society that was not industrialized. And these include the Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey, the Chinese Empire, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Central Europe. One important factor in looking at this scenario is that the European powers that had expanded in the Americas at this point have lost their colonies in the new hemisphere. In the 19th century, almost all the colonies became independent. And so, as we know, since the industrial society needs colonies, now what they do is they predate even more heavily on the countries of Asia and Africa. So we observe 2 styles of imperialism. One is more informal and the other one is more formal or direct. Okay, the informal style of imperialism is one that involves the domination of trade, investment, and business in a certain area. This style is more typical in the countries of Asia because there are complex societies that predate the arrival of the colonists from Europe with their own traditional elites. So often the informal style of imperialism involves an alliance between the colonists and the local elites. Then there is a more formal or direct style of imperialism that involves the domination of the people and the land. This is more typical in the areas, in the regions of Africa, because there the societies are by and large less hierarchical and less formalized. What are the motives of imperialism? Of course, primary motive is economic gain. And we have seen how industrial societies need colonies because that's where their primary materials come from, the plantations in the colonies, to be manufactured in the industry. Then there are the political motives. Of course, this kind of society that needs import from plantations is a society that needs political control of strategic points where they are crucial to the traffic of these merchandises. For example, in the 19th century, the Canal of Suez is opened between the Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea, and of course and the Red Sea. And then, of course, that is a very strategic point that industrial countries, have very good reasons to want to control. Okay. Then there are the cultural motives, and for these we have to go back a little bit to the ideas that we got from Montesquieu, the idea of cultural relativism. We have to understand that European colonials didn't practice cultural relativism a whole lot. They were in many ways very ethnocentric. What they believed is that they were bringing the true civilization and the true faith to the people of the colonies. In fact, they were simply making these lands more comfortable for themselves. They were imposing their languages, their laws, their traditions, so it made it more comfortable for them. And they were often very unappreciative of the ways in which the local, the indigenous cultures had really stewarded these lands for centuries, often in much more sustainable ways that the Europeans ever did. Then, of course, the empire had tools. These tools were mainly technologies. Transportation technologies, which included railroads, steamships, and eventually the canals. The Suez Canal that united the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean in 1869, it was opened, and then the Panama Canal that united the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean was opened in 1914. They also included military technologies, powerful weapons like machine guns and rifles and gunboats that expanded the power, the military power of the imperial colonialists. And also technologies of communication. For example, the British Empire was known for its mail system, and in fact it worked fairly well in India, to the point that, for example, before the Suez Canal was open, it would take about 2 months for a letter to come back and forth between Great Britain and India. And eventually, after the Suez Canal, it only took 2 weeks. This may seem very long time to us, but if you think that Marco Polo took years to go to China and come back, you see that communication technologies have evolved quite a bit in the modern era. Eventually, the telegraph was invented, and it was primarily used for military purposes, but also for civil purposes, and that's how the telegrams were possible. A telegram is transmitted immediately and arrives, but it often contains a very, very brief message. So now we come to the first map that shows us sort of a landscape of European imperialism in Asia. Okay, so we can observe that the forms of European imperialism in Asia in the 19th century do not involve a complete domination of the territory. There are two sovereign nations, China and Japan. And then there is a large region, the subcontinent of India, which is dominated by Great Britain. Initially, this domination is maintained through one of the most important joint stock companies in history, the Company of the East Indies. Okay, so basically India is under the rule of this trade company that has established its trading posts and then eventually starts to really practice administering this territory. Eventually, the Queen Victoria in 1837 brings India under direct imperial rule. So it's a change, from a more indirect to a more formal or direct mode of domination. Nonetheless, many of the princely states in the inland of India still remain fairly untouched or not directly affected in the ways that the more coastal areas are. If we move southeast in Asia, we find French Indochina, which included Vietnam and Laos. And in here we notice one of the plantation purposes was really the plantations of rubber trees that then would provide all the rubber necessary for the European industry. Further southeast, we notice all the insular part of the Asian continent, and those Southeast Asia islands are dominated by the Dutch, by the Netherlands, the government of Netherlands. Then we look briefly at two empires whose territories decline, whose territories and power decline. Map 2. In Map 2, we observe the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. This empire lost most of its territory between 1800 and 1914. How did it lose its territories? In the Balkans, it lost territory to independent nations. Seeing the idea of nationalism, national independence has an effect, including Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. In North Africa, it lost territory to other industrial powers, to European nations that were acquiring territories for their expansion in the industrial era, including Algeria, which became a French colony, and then Libya, which eventually became an Italian colony. Egypt also kind of became independent of the Ottoman domination in this period. There was an attempt to become more modernized, and that was the Party of the Young Turks. In 1889 was founded. This party was founded by Turkish leaders who had been exiled in France, and so had learned everything about the Enlightenment, about modernity, about civil liberties, and tried to export these ideas to the Ottoman Empire. But this didn't really show the decline of the empire. Also because an industrial heart to the production system was not present. Then we have the case map 3 of this chapter of the Empire of China. We remember that the Empire of China had expanded enormously under the Qing dynasty. And China was a sovereign nation, but its sovereignty became significantly undermined in this period by the areas of influence of the European colonial powers in Asia and by Japan. And then by the treaties, the unequal treaties that applied to port cities of China. So we observe in this map that Manchuria and Korea came under the influence of Japan. Then North Manchuria came under the influence of Russia, whereas North China and Tibet came under the influence of Great Britain, and South China and Indochina became under the influence of France. Another important factor at this time is the opium trade. Okay. We know that China exported silks, and that British East Indies companies controlled the commerce of silks from China. They were supposed to pay the Chinese merchants with silver, but instead they often paid them with opium. And the traffic of opium, even use of opium, was forbidden by the Qing dynasty. But the Qing dynasty didn't really enforce this prohibition. So in 1839, the government of China took action to halt the opium trade, and this started the Opium Wars from 1939 to 1842. The British had superior weapons, and so they won the war, and that's how they imposed these unequal treaties to cities that were also harbors or commercial ports, including Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Macau. That were open to foreign trade, even though the government of China didn't want that. There were innovative forces within the Qing dynasty. What happened at one point was that clearly many people from China, especially from the city of Nanjing, had heard about the new ideas, the Enlightenment, liberalism, civil liberties, even socialism. So we have in 1853 to 57 the Taiping Rebellion. Taiping means great peace. These rebels wanted a utopian socialist society. They wanted to abolish private property. They wanted communal wealth. They wanted a distribution of resources according to needs. They also wanted a simplification of the written language so that everybody could learn to read and write. And they wanted to abolish foot binding that still affected many women in Chinese society, and also the practice of concubinage, according to which a man was entitled to a wife, but then a series of concubines that were often pitted against one another for competition. And then, so they wanted an equality of the sexes. So that was quite radical for China at that time. Eventually, the Taiping rebellion was crushed, and actually the European states gave not only advice but also weapons toward the defeat of this rebellion. So the Qing dynasty kind of learned the lesson and said, well, maybe we can do something like self-strengthening. We can strengthen ourselves, do a sort of enlightened type of transformation that comes top down and therefore addresses the issues brought up by the rebels. But still, the country didn't have enough of an industrial core economy. Eventually, Vietnam, which was an area of influence from the Qing Empire, was snatched away by France. And there was a period called the 100 Days Reform in 1898, where the emperor wanted to transform China into a constitutional monarchy with civil liberties, education, and a more diversified economy. This was crushed by the empress. And then what happened was the Boxer Rebellion. This was also encouraged by the Empress Cixi, who felt that all these things were happening because of foreigners. These foreign ideas that were now brought into China were the cause of all trouble. And so there was a sort of demonification of all these ideas and of foreigners themselves. That was the Boxers' Rebellion. By and large, we see that for the Chinese Empire, this is a century of weakened power, loss of sovereignty, and colonial influence by both the European powers and by Japan. Okay. In map 4, finally, we look at Africa. We remember the previous maps of Africa that really focused on the triangular trade and the impoverishment of the region by these deportations, and the fact that really the vast interior of the territory of Africa was not directly dominated by European powers. If we look at this map now, we see that there isn't an inch of Africa that isn't dominated by some direct formal imperialism from some European power. In particular, we notice that the eastern part of Africa is more dominated by the British, and the west part of Africa is more dominated by the French. And there are different other countries that have established their colonies there. Why was Africa desirable to these colonial powers? Primary materials. Consider the South African diamonds. The Europeans attribute this enormous value to this stone, and there was plenty of that there. By the need for an industrial economy to feed itself on a plantation economy. For example, the rubber plantations in Belgian Congo. And very often, especially in these plantation economies, very cruel, extremely punishing forms of colonialism were practiced. For example, if some of the workers in the plantation didn't meet the daily quota of what they were supposed to harvest, the colonials went to the extent of chopping off their hands, considering what kind of atmosphere and damage that does to the local communities and societies, the practice of these very punishing forms of colonialism. Another important episode of this direct and formal imperialism in Africa is the Boer War in South Africa, between the Afrikaner, or the white population that lived in South Africa at that time, and Great Britain. It started in 1899 and ended in 1902. So the Afrikaner wanted independence from Britain, and eventually they lost against Great Britain. But the way that Britain continued to sustain its domination of South Africa was by helping the Boers or Afrikaner dominate the blacks and therefore establish what we know as the regime of apartheid in South Africa. So we also note that in this period there are new imperial powers that emerge. One is the United States, that, as we have seen, not only snatches away vast territories of Mexico and moves along in its march to dominate the North America, the temperate zone of North America from coast to coast, but also expands well beyond that, especially with the Spanish-American War in 1898, when it acquires the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, and also the vast region of the Philippines, which was previously a Spanish colony. Okay. So we look now at some of the legacies of imperialism. First, we see that, from the cultural viewpoint, imperialism has an effect on the local population, whether they like it or not. Example. In the areas of India and Ceylon, before the British domination, people were not particularly fond of tea. It wasn't their national beverage. But then the British came and they loved tea, and so they turned many forests into tea gardens. And then eventually the local populations acquired a taste for tea. And so today it's a very common beverage. We also see that, from a cultural viewpoint, the massive migrations to the New World really have an effect on the cultures of the New World at this time. For example, from the year 1800 to the year 1914, about 50 million European people moved to the New World. They were from Italy, Russia, Poland, Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, Germany. And many of them were Jews, of course, regardless of what country they came from. Those migrants were more voluntary. They paid for their own passage usually. Migrants who came from many Asian lands and also from Africa and the Caribbean were often indentured. In other words, they couldn't pay for their own passage, and so they had to pay with labor, unpaid labor, once they arrived. And those were from China, Japan, Java, Africa, and the Caribbean. So acquiring these 50+ million people had a significant effect on the societies of the New World. And it was a result of imperialism. It was a result of these policy of really enlarging the economy to attract new labor force. Finally, we look at the relationship between empire and society. As we remember, people who are oppressed don't like it. And so when they can, they always oppose some resistance. So there was always some form of colonial conflict. Colonization didn't happen without conflict. And one of the examples we have here is the Sepoy Rebellion, where the Indian people manifested their hostility to the colonial rule. So what happened during the 19th century is that the practice of science came to serve the politics of racial and cultural oppression that the empire was founded on. This is known as scientific racism. Okay, we see that the culture of science manufactures the ideas that then function as tools of oppression for people who are different, say, by race or by culture. Examples. We have two scientists, one French, Gobineau, and the other one Italian, Lombroso, who at this time began to study the skulls of dead people to find out which races have the biggest skull. If the skull is bigger, that in their view, that means that the brain, that the person's brain was bigger, and bigger brain determines racial superiority. Okay. And we also have a more subtle way to affirm a similar concept that comes to us from Darwin, the scientist who authored the very important book, The Origin of the Species, which was released in 1859. Okay. Two very important concepts in this book. First, life evolves via competition. Competition is what makes life evolve. Competition, namely the survival of the fittest. If you're fit, you survive. If you don't, you don't. And therefore, this competition among species or among groups in different species is what makes life evolve. So it's a good thing, right? Of course, Darwin didn't emphasize the collaboration, the collaborative aspect into evolution. If we collaborate, we can all evolve together. He was aware of it, but he didn't emphasize it. So here we have a scientific ideology that tells us that in a way, when the colonials came and they won, it's because they were more adapted, and that's how life evolves. In reality, they were not adapted. The colonial people and the colonial powers were very destructive of the environment where they arrived, and today we are more aware of that, so we don't see that necessarily in the same light. But at the time of Darwin, that was the idea. Two, that now by science, people know that humans were not created directly by the hand of God, but rather they evolved from a previous species, like apes, right? So who is superior among those groups of humans? Clearly the ones that are more evolved, and being more evolved means being more different from apes, which of course creates all kinds of possible racial discriminations. So these are the ideas that science evolves as a cultural practice that come to be in service of racial and cultural oppression. So we are now coming to part 7 of the second volume of our global history book, Traditions and Encounters. And we are going to introduce this part. What is this part about? It's about contemporary global realignments. Basically, it helps us understand the century that just ended with the end of the second millennium, namely the 20th century. So part 7 focuses on the global events of the 20th century. It interprets the outbreak of World War I in 1914 as the real beginning of the century, even as the conflict had been brewing for a while the new global empires were being built. The part also shows this century, the 20th century, as one of the most problematic, violent, and dangerous in the history of humankind. Also as a century when the diversity of humankind was affirmed, as well as the diversity of nature and the interconnectedness of all life on Earth in a sort of planetary consciousness that is often revealed by cyberspace. So in the 20th century, for the first time, humans possess the technologies to eliminate all life from Earth. At this time, we also have the technologies to interconnect all life on Earth via cybernetic planetary consciousness. How are we going to use these technologies? Is a big brain powered by a heart that will put intelligence in service of life? These are the questions left open by the 20th century for the next millennium. So in this introduction, we get a bit of an overview of the content of part 7. We notice that at the beginning of World War I, in the early part of the 20th century, the European dominance in Africa and Asia is unprecedented. This is due to the formation of national states, industrialization, and imperial expansion in Europe. Then we look at World War I that happened during the years from 1914 and 1918. We look at what was this war the result of? What were the causes that resulted in this war? Well, national rivalries between formed nations that had mainly an industrial economy, colonial disputes, namely disputes that happened between colonized and colonizers, and then the nationalist aspirations of those countries that had not yet been become independent from old-style empires. We see that in these 4 years of war, the European powers exhausted their economic wealth, and also, in a way, they exhausted their political primacy. We have to remember that the first real example of socialism happened during this war in 1917, when the Russian Revolution exploded. Then we look at the interwar years. Interwar years, they cover a little more than 2 decades, and they are characterized by a certain level of global instability, which explains why then World War II happened. So the years of the interwar period are 1918 to 1931 if you look at Asia, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria and China, or 1918 to 1939 if you look at the European context. What happens during this time? Well, in 1929 and the subsequent year, the world, especially the industrialized world, plunges in what is known as the Great Depression. During this time is when also fascist dictatorships develop in the countries of Italy and Germany. Nationalism evolves in Asia, and in the Soviet Union, we have the phenomenon of state-sponsored industrialization. So then we come to the years of World War II. 1931, if you look at Asia, 1939 is the beginning year in Europe, and then it ends in 1945. So what happens in 1931? Japan invades Manchuria. It invades the Chinese part of Manchuria. Then in the late 30s, we observe the significant territorial expansion of the Nazi regime in Europe. So in a way, we can conclude that World War I and II were world wars because the European countries that were in conflict dominated world affairs. So if there was a conflict between European countries, it would become global because they dominated the affairs of the other continents. And of course, within Europe, the Nazi regime was really the cause that got all other powers to ally with each other because of that strong, relentless expansion in the European territory. So when we look at the period after World War II, we have the Cold War period. Most of us either remember it or our parents remember it. So during this period, there is peace, but there is a war that is considered cold and remains cold unless you are in the hot spots of the strategic points of conflict, as in, say, Vietnam, for example, or even Chile. Okay. So what is the Cold War? It's a conflict between the forces of capitalism and communism. Capitalism is represented by the USA, and communism is represented by the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Republics of Russia. These are the new superpowers that emerge from World War II. So basically, also during this period, what happens is that the European empires in Asia and Africa, get dismantled by the wave of independence movements from the regions of Asia and Africa that were dominated by the colonial powers of Europe. Nonetheless, neocolonial problems emerge in these countries that are now becoming independent, and some of them come from the interference of the two superpowers who want to exercise influence in these areas of the world. And also from post-colonial problems that most nations that become independent face, like, say, lack of a diverse economy, scarcity of skills, flight of the skilled labor force, and internal conflicts within groups of these territories. So finally, we come to the time when the Cold War ends. It ends with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as most of us remember, and we come to a chapter that helps us understand the most important global contemporary issues that are still part of our world today. So one is globalization. The globalization is a mode of integration that has been made possible in recent times by digital technologies. But it is also a way to evolve that gives way to systems of monopoly and control, new systems of monopoly and control that are cybernetic. It also is an age of new impersonal and interminable wars. If you think that today, a country that has drones can wage wars, without risking any soldiers on a country that doesn't, you can see how this impersonal and interminable character of these new wars is quite disturbing. There is also a new class of new rich. The new rich, or the nouveau riche, as the French aristocrats would say, of the digital age. These are the rich of the digital age, not of the industrial age, who impoverish the planet by evading taxes and hiding their wealth. We know that if a family has enough wealth for 3 generations down the road, it is in their best interest to hide their wealth and not circulate it in the economy, because there's always a risk with any enterprise one might become involved in. And today we are paying the price of this new wealth, of the new rich of the digital age, which is hiding in some secret vaults. Also, and very important, is the new energy problem. Now we have an awareness of the link between fossil fuels and global warming and climate change, climate instability, actually, as the climate does change. So we are aware that the fossil fuels that really have powered the first phase of the Industrial Revolution and the second phase, with coal or carbon and oil or petrol, and the first and second phase respectively, that really these fossil fuels are very dangerous to the stability of the climate on the only planet we have, and that therefore many of them would better stay in the soil rather than burn and make our atmosphere unbreathable, or possibly even burn up the whole planet. So there is also a desire to return to ancient forms of collaboration and sharing that really come from the sense of danger that characterizes our age, in relation to the stability of the hospitality that we and all the other species that accompany us have enjoyed on the third planet of the solar system for so long. We would rather not have that end. And we do have, unfortunately, the power to make that end. So in terms of how the chapter configuration for this part 7, we have one chapter, the first chapter, devoted to the Great War, also known as World War I, from 1914 to 1918. Then we have a second chapter that focuses on Europe in the interwar period. That chapter is called An Age of Anxiety because, again, having too much power for one's own good can cause one some anxiety. Then we have a third chapter that focuses on the same interwar period, but with an emphasis on Asia, Africa, and Latin America. How do nationalisms and political identities form in those arenas? Then we have a fourth chapter that focuses on World War II, and especially on the years of the war in Europe, from 1939 to 1945. Then we have a fifth chapter that focuses on the Cold War, that basically starts very soon after the peace of 1945 in 1948, and then ends with the collapse of the Soviet Union in around the mid-90s. Okay, and then we have a sixth chapter that concludes our survey with a glance at this new world that we have created, a world without borders.